Okay, time for another tutorial. This is a tutorial on making a master mold. Now, this is a master mold for resin molds that will be used to produce silicone parts, typically platinum silicone parts for medical simulators and that sort of application. So, we've done a tutorial in the past, and I'll link to it at the end of this video, that is a master mold for silicone molds for resin casting. So a little bit of a reversal on that. So in this sort of scenario, we have a resin mold that, in this case, this is one of our little ear mold patterns. And a resin mold like this is preferable to say a silicone mold, because we're going to be casting platinum silicone into the resin negative mold. So platinum silicone doesn't typically like tin cure silicones, and a lot of polyurethanes are not compatible. So a resin mold is really nice. And because it's a hard mold, sometimes we could do multiple pieces and keep the seams really thin. But in some scenarios, those of you who are casting like medical simulators and things like that, where you need to recreate the actual mold multiple times, you might be in a situation where you need to make a master mold of your original resin mold. So in order to do that, we're going to take the original resin mold, dam that up with foam core, and then make a negative silicone mold over the top of that. Now, as I mentioned in previous videos, when you're working with resins like this is an EasyFlow 60 resin master mold, or I'm sorry, just a resin mold. And EasyFlow 60 is compatible with plenty of our platinum silicone systems without any kind of issue. But when in doubt, if you're working with a different resin system and you're curious if that is compatible, you must do your own testing, because if we have not shown it being used in that capacity, assume that it's a contaminant. So do your own testing, make sure that the resins you're using and the process you're using is all the pieces are compatible. So again, just to recap, what we have here is a collection of various resin molds. These are all different types of resin molds, some with our using our ArcCast pourable resin formula. And these are all for pouring silicone in products. So the idea here is we want to reproduce the mold. And some of you are working in a capacity where you might actually be producing the resin mold for resale. So this is an important step for those of you doing that, because this allows you to kind of quantify that process and be able to faithfully reproduce that original resin mold. Also, there's going to be times when you might make the original mold in one type of resin because of just simplicity's sake, like we've done here, and then you might want to reproduce that resin mold later on in a different resin system, like say BJB 1630 or something like that, a more shrink resistant tooling resin. So a lot of considerations to be made there. But without further ado, our first step is to prepare our original resin mold. Okay, now our resin mold here, this is a resin, shall we say, mold of a body part, to keep it happy for the YouTube censors. And this was in EasyFlow 60. This is just a hard, solid plastic mold. And I've anchored this to a piece of foam core board using hot glue. And that's an important step, because even though resin feels dense and heavy, it is lower density than the silicone we'll be using to make the mold. So if we're not careful, if we have a low density part and it's not anchored, and we pour a high density material over that, what we have is the same effect as you would have with an ice cube, where it wants to float up and dislodge. So if you've not anchored your part well, or heaven forbid, you've not anchored it at all, expect that part to float. So we've anchored this with hot glue to our baseboard, and I've come in here towards that edge, and filled that in with Protolina clay. Now, Protolina clay looks suspiciously like a high explosive material for bridge demolition, but it's not. It's actually just a sulfur-free clay. And Protolina in these bars is fantastic for this kind of work. It's soft enough, you can just pinch off little pieces and use that to fill in little areas where you've done cleanup work. And again, it's sulfur-free, so we don't have to worry about it having any contaminants that are going to interfere with the cure of our silicone. Now what we're going to do is we're making a mold of a mold. So now that I've got this in place, anchored to my baseboard, I'm going to build a dam with more foam core board. And I want that to go outside the original mold by right around an inch, maybe a little bit less than an inch. I'm going to be using one of the new BJB silicones for this mold that's a fairly firm silicone formula, so I don't have to make that margin too thick. So this is going to be with the 5140, and that'll allow me to keep those margins fairly thin. And what this is going to do, it's going to pour into the middle, of course, and capture the pattern, but also over the outside and capture the walls too. And what that does is that ultimately that will give me a nice clean mold that I can then reliably pour resin molds into that negative silicone mold. But that'll make a lot more sense in the final part. But what we've done here is just done a little bit of housekeeping around the edge. We just don't want a gap down there where that silicone could get underneath our pattern, or in this case our mold, and cause that to lock in any way. And again, this is stuck down to that baseboard using hot glue. So that keeps that from moving around and most importantly from floating up in the mold. Okay, I'm not going to cover the entire construction of my mold box just because it's literally like watching glue dry. So what I'm doing here is I've just always use a good straight edge and a square, carpenter square, to make sure everything is at right angles. But foam core, one of the reasons I use that for this kind of project, it's very easy to cut and modify and shape according to your needs. And I don't have to break out my table saw for that. So one little word though about a hot glue gun. This is kind of the hot rod hot glue gun you can pick up at like Uline. This is a much better quality glue gun than what you're going to find at hobby stores. And also glue sticks. All of my glue on this is typically going to be on the outside of the box, but just remember there are some glue stick formulas that inhibit platinum silicone. So I've stumbled into that lately where I picked up a huge bundle of glue sticks on the cheap and found out that they do inhibit. Not majorly, and typically it's only in the corners of your mold box, but something to be aware of. So when in doubt, always test your materials, make sure that everything is going to be compatible. Yeah, I've got my foam core box secured and ready for my silicone pour. I just need to release it. And we also need to do some maths. We can determine as close to possible, the exact volume of this mold. Now, this particular box, this is secured pretty well with our hot glue all over. And because this is not a super deep mold, we don't have to worry about the hydraulic pressure that we get from a really tall mold. But something to be aware of, when you start making foam core boxes that are really tall, sometimes you can have some hydraulic pressure bowing the sides of that box. So when in doubt, you can always reinforce those with some extra struts made of foam core board, or even some wood material or acrylic. But just be aware that there is a point at which you start developing enough hydraulic pressure that you can push those mold walls out a little bit. So be mindful of that. So our mold box is 11 inches long by 3.5 inches deep by 8.5 inches wide. So that gives us 327.25 cubic inches. So this is actually going to take a fair amount of silicone, but we can subtract the volume of our mold because that's going to knock that down considerably. So we're going to take 327 and subtract 162. And we have about 165 cubic inches. And we're going to pad that just a little bit, but then we take that and divide that by about 25 cubic inches per pound, and we wind up with about 6.6 pounds. So we're going to go and round up for safety here and do 7 pounds of silicone. Now, also critical here to make sure we release everything. Super Release PTR, this was formerly known as Eject It 33. This is an excellent release for releasing silicone rubber, liquid silicone rubber from a lot of non-porous pattern surfaces. We are now ready to mix our silicone. Now, because this is going to take a fair amount of silicone, I'm actually going to break this down into 2 batches. And that will allow a little bit more ease of mixing. And if we need to, depending on our vacuum chamber setup, that allows us to degas 2 batches a little bit, separate, make for more room in our vacuum chamber. Now, because this is a relatively simple mold, pretty straightforward, and this is a pretty low viscosity silicone, I am going to do this without vacuum degassing. And part of that is just a little personal experiment just to see how well this degasses on its own. So this is a relatively new formula of silicone, and one that was kind of surprising because this is a 40 Shore A, and typically a 40 Shore A would be a really thick base rubber. So I was pleasantly surprised to find this particular one with a really low, relatively low viscosity. And the 1-to-1 mix ratio is nice as well. And like I said, this is a pretty straightforward mold, so if I get some air bubbles in this away from the pattern, no big deal. But if it's something really critical, especially if we're going to be pressure casting into the mold, then it's a really good idea to vacuum degas. Always vacuum degas your silicone if you're going to be doing pressure casting into the finished mold. Okay, so we have our 2 batches ready to mix up. And our working time with this is, we have plenty of working time. This one has right around 30 minutes working time at room temperature. So we have more than enough time to get this well mixed and vacuum degassed before we do our pour. And just like with our resin systems, remember to take the time necessary to scrape the sides of the bottom of the container. And it's not so much how long you mix, but how thorough you are. So if you can thoroughly mix and correctly mix in 30 seconds, then great. But just taking longer to mix does not necessarily mean that you have been more thorough. Make sure you take time to scrape the bottom of the bucket and the sides of the container. That is typically one of those mistakes people make with silicone when they're starting out, is they mix up exactly what they need for a project, and then when they start filling up their mold or their mold box with silicone, they realize that they're going to be short unless they get every drop out of the bucket. And then what happens is that silicone that's stuck down there at the bottom that was not very well mixed, now they need it and they pour that out and they wind up with part of their mold that is not completely cured. And again, this is not vacuum degassed, so I'm just going to pick one corner, one of the little tips when you're mixing silicone and pouring it and you don't have the ability to vacuum degas. Just make sure you stay in one spot and pour in a thin stream, and just don't dump everything into the mold immediately. And there we go. Now, a little added trick here to help break the surface tension and release the air bubbles. I'm going to blast the top with some 2500 spray release, and notice that I'm using 2500, not 2300. 2300 is pure silicone oil and can sometimes cause cure inhibition when it comes in contact with liquid silicone. So be careful about that. But we're ready to let that sit and naturally de-air. A lot of those bubbles are just going to come up and pop on their own. And this has a demold time of right around 3 to 4 hours at room temperature. And just remember, this being a platinum system, if we raise the temperature up, if we say bump the room temperature up to 95 degrees or so, or here in Texas 100 degrees outside in the parking lot, that's probably going to reduce the mold time, demold time to probably about an hour and a half or so. So we're going to step back, let that go and cure, and then we'll be back in a few hours to check it out. So our silicone here is completely set, and now it's like Christmas, only different. Okay, now we have our silicone mold and we're ready to demold our mold. So this will, of course, yield a mold of a mold. So again, that's one of the benefits of a foam core box, is it's really easy to just rip that off with minimal expense. And there we go, a beautiful mold of a mold. So now we have minimal cleanup here because, again, the bulk of this part was resin. So we just need to pick out any leftover Protolina clay, and we're ready for casting. Now, one of the benefits to this kind of arrangement like this, to be able to reproduce this mold as needed, is because we've got this original mold, we can put this on a scale and figure out actually down to the gram exactly what this takes to pour up an easy flow resin. Okay, now we have our mold cleaned out relatively. We've got a little bit of clay in there, but that will typically come out with the first cast. Now, we don't have to use release when we're casting this, but we're going to go ahead and spray down a little bit of 2500 in this, but this is an important little detail. When we're casting our resin into this, we don't want to use 2300 spray release. And the reason for that is, again, that 2300 spray release is pure silicone oil, and we don't want that transferring over to our mold that we're going to be using for casting more silicone, because again, that could create adhesion issues. So by using this 2500, that just ensures this is a mineral oil blend, so this is much safer to use when casting silicone. So we don't have to worry about that release transferring over to the finished mold. Now, one of the nice things too about having a mold like this of a mold, to be able to reproduce this on demand rather than just having a pattern that we pour our resin over, is this allows us to use multiple resins up against this mold. Like 1630 could be used if we have a more of a tooling application or a high heat application. So we could pour a tooling resin like 1630, or any of the other like TC800 or EasyFlow 60 or the ArcCast pourable. But again, cannot stress enough, make sure whatever you're using for this process is compatible with the silicone that you're casting. And the benefit now, because we've got this mold done, we could actually carve into the mold, use a scalpel and cut the weight of the resin required for the cast right there into the mold. So every time we go to cast this, we see written on it, or your shop guys see this takes, say, 700 grams or 1500 grams or what have you. But that way you know exactly to the drop what it takes to fill a given mold, and that eliminates a lot of waste. But most importantly, this eliminates a lot of the need for all the shop work that goes into making individual molds. So now you could have a production line that's actually producing individual molds like this, and all of them will be precise. Now, just for fun here, I thought we'd wrap up this video with making another mold from this. So we're going to use EasyFlow 60 again, just like the original mold. And EasyFlow 60 again is 1:1 by volume, or 90 to 100, or I'm sorry, 100A to 90B by weight. So be aware of that. If you are weighing this out, make sure you're using the weight ratio, because if you mix it 1-to-1 by weight, you're going to get too much part B, and you're going to wind up with an oily end product that will not take paint. And again, these large pours like this with Easy Flow 60 are not difficult to do as long as you stir deliberately and accurately and get your part poured. Typically where people run into problems is I've had people think before that it has to start getting warm before they can pour it, and it is way too late. If the bucket's getting warm or hot, you are pouring at the very end of the working time. So always make sure that you get everything stirred up and then immediately get it poured into the mold. Now, one thing I'm going to do here, we're just going to pour, we just need just enough to cover the pattern. We only need about 1/4 of an inch of resin, if that, down there at the bottom. So we really don't even have to fill the entire mold. I made that mold deep enough that that's not going to be an issue. We just give a quick blast of our 2500 spray release, and that breaks that surface tension and gets all those bubbles to pop that come to the surface. And there we go. Have a beautiful mold of a mold. Well, there you have the process of making a master mold using 5140 platinum silicone. And that's a tough mold that we can use for decades if treated properly. If we're casting resins, usually you could get dozens of pulls out of that, if not more than that. Again, if you take care of it and use minimal release between castings. As always, make sure you check the video description for links to the products. I hope this was helpful to those of you who have been asking us about this process. And be sure to also check at the end of this, I'm going to put a link to a previous tutorial about I'm going to link to one of the videos leading up to this, but also to another master mold video dealing with a master mold for resin casting, for making a master mold for making multiple silicone molds. So be sure to check that out as well. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and of course like the video if you indeed liked it, and click the little bell icon so you get notified when we create new content. But that's it for today. Be sure again to check out the end screen for the other master mold video, as well as the kind of prequel, as it were, to this tutorial.